Well, my dad was born in a small town in Quebec, Montjoly. It's out on the Gaspé Peninsula. And my dad was the 21st child in his family and the youngest. And so it was very difficult. This is back in, I think he was born in 1917. Very difficult to feed that many kids. My grandfather he worked on the railroad in Quebec. And so anyway, it turned out when my dad was about 14 years old, he came out west with one of his older brothers. And one of his older brothers was a priest, and he was assigned to a parish in the Drumheller area. And so my dad said, well, you know, there's nothing for me here. So he came out west with my uncle. And when he was about 19 years old, my uncle was moved to Canmore. And so my dad just so happened to find a job at Canada Cement at that time. And he worked there pretty much all his life. He didn't have a car, and I can remember him telling stories about my mom, who was born in Calgary. She had some family in Canmore, and sort of similar to Grace and I, they kind of connected at a dance one night, and he told stories of walking from Exshaw to Canmore just to go and on a date with her. I mean, there was nothing in Exshaw. It was more, you know, and so it was easier for him to get to Canmore than her to come here. So he would walk, hitchhike, catch a freight, you know, whatever that you needed to do back then. And he did a lot of things when he was young in the Drumheller area. He was an outrider for some chuck wagon boys down there, and they had chuck wagon stampedes, and he ended up, his trade was a bricklayer, and he worked on farms and when he was younger, and all sorts of things like that. But and when he came here, he started out as a laborer. And back in those days, I don't know if the plant was operating 12 months a year. I know it wasn't in the mid 1900s, but or like 1915, I think, or so, they were still only working a few months a year. But when my dad came, it could have been that he was on full time, full 12 months a year. I know my grandfather, who also worked here, he would only work in the summer here, and then he'd move back to Calgary and work there for the winter. But yeah, my dad, until they changed the process in the plant again, that was when it became a multinational company, and they needed to upgrade everything, and new processes of making cement, and my dad just decided, you know, I've worked here a long time, and it was just time for him to go, which he did. And so he built a house prior to that in 1962, built a house, and that's where they retired. And thoroughly enjoyed living in Exshaw. They had no inkling at all to move out. It was a lot of their friends, upon retiring, moved west out to Kelowna, Salmon Arm, areas like that. A lot of them came back because of the gloomy conditions in the winter, the overcast skies and whatnot. Whereas here you might have the wind, but you also have the Chinooks and the awesome blue skies. And my dad, thoroughly enjoyed that. Even though he wasn't an outdoorsman per se, he'd just walk around and look at the mountains, look at the sky. I knew that. I saw him do that lots. Just out in his garden. I don't know how big the garden was. We worked that for those few years, but and I remember seeing him just leaning on his shovel, looking up at the mountains, and it was really this was a special treat for him to have lived here. He never got back. He never got back east that much. Probably once every 10 years or so, they'd make a trek back to the eastern Quebec, but they really enjoyed it here.
Your mom's family was here.
My mom's family was here. One of her brothers, Stephen, worked for Canada Cement, probably would have been 45 years at least, right from before going to the war, and he went overseas, returned in 45, late 45, and continued his employment here till he retired when he was 65. So he had around 45 years service here. And my grandfather worked here at Lafarge, Canada Cement at that time. They all, back in early 1900s, there wasn't much employment, even in Calgary. And when my grandfather found work out here, even though it was just sporadic at the first several years when the plant was first started, and I think the plant originally started in 1910, around that era. He eventually got a full-time job here as well, and then that's when they moved out to Akshaw. What year that was, I'm not sure. But her mom and dad, my grandma and grandpa, they came from Poland in, I want to say 1905.
Steve was born there.
Yeah, my uncle Stephen was born in Poland, and he and my grandfather came over here first, settled in Calgary, and once he got sort of secured with employment, then he wired for my grandmother to come over, and so she and my uncle, who was, I think he was 5 years old at the time, managed to make it across the ocean. They landed at Pier 21 in Halifax, and trained it across the country to Calgary. Again, they lived here all their lives as well. One of my mom's other brothers, he moved to Calgary, and one of her sisters moved to Canmore. She got married and moved to Canmore, but they all stayed in the valley except for my one uncle.
And Uncle Peter worked at the store.
Yes, the general store here. My uncles they were very athletic fellows, and baseball was the big thing back in the 20s and 30s. And they both were really, really, as story says, they were really, really good ball players. And they found work. There was Jenkins store, grocery store, employed a lot of the local people, of course, and my one uncle worked there for many years until that closed down, and then that's when he decided to move to Calgary. Where it's